I mean, you talked about revealing the real, or like replacing versus revealing the real, and I mean, I'd be interested in like how much, I mean, like you think you might be, or like this kind of work might be revealing the real, and in juxtaposition that Helge probably says that these things are in a way replacing or constituting like a new real, and then Alvaro maybe kind of reflected in these architectural utopias, because I think that also is quite strongly in there, because it's, you know, like it's also like something that wants to create reality, and you reflect on that almost like ironically through using animals and turning your house into a sauna. But I think it would be interesting if you three would maybe like have a little conversation about like what, and maybe even what is the real for you, and how you think these kind of like things, you know, what is real?
I think I have a really short answer in my case. I mean, like I said, that all the different or simulation or simulators, I think, like we've also heard in the session this morning, cannot replace the real. So I think this is, I think, clear. But on the other hand, all the different, if we're talking about live and virtual simulation where actual human agents deal with other humans and with technology, and often in even critical situations or critical settings where something can happen even in the simulation to them. They can get injured, or they can be exposed to stresses. The experience of the simulator or the simulation is real, and the pressures are real to perform well in simulation. And I think, but then there are other types of simulation where you can go completely beyond this framework of maybe even simulation ethics. And
I'd rather ask another question rather than talking about metaphysics, because I'm not even good at that. Because you talked about pressure, I was wondering how important is affect and the body, and actually sort of feeling emotionally that something's going on in producing a simulation that is effective in the sort of sense that you presented on your last slide. So to what extent do people really need to be stressed out by what they're doing in the live simulator? Is that...
Actually, this is one of the central questions that I'm going to be looking at during the fellowship at Max, is how much you can, or how much usually simulations expose people to these kind of stresses. But I think it's a difference of whether you do simulation for research, for training, or for forecasting, for instance. And I think if you're doing really exercises or training simulations, people feel the pressure because they need to prepare themselves. And if you look at pilots, for instance, they will feel. I mean, first of all, the fidelity of the simulators is often very high. So you do have, you know, first of all, you have physical effect. So you maybe have a motion simulator. You may be stressed. You may not be hearing very well. There may be different kinds of habitability issues that have an impact on you. But at the same time, you feel what's at stake. And then if you look at research simulations where people are really, you know, for instance, deprived of certain kinds of stimuli for a number of months or even over a year, then this has an effect. And I think it's a really interesting question of, you know, how much do people have to contribute themselves to the fidelity of the simulation? And then is it real for them then? And maybe after a while it is.
I really enjoyed your presentations and examples. I especially liked your point of the humbleness. I think, and to come back to your example of the quote by Sherry Turkle of what was it? Revealing the reality, yeah? Revealing the reality. And I don't think this is metaphysics, yeah? But you were explaining the Lansing examples, the computer and the water goddess. There are different realities, because behind all the presentations today is the idea that there is we all share an epistemology, yeah, that there is a reality out there that is independent of an observer. And I don't think that it is, because the indigenous people there in Bali, they adapted to the environment, observed, developed some rules to negotiate this, developed some models to negotiate this, and then suddenly bottom up. And then suddenly from outside people come and introduce top-down, without really understanding, a different system to the reality they perceive. And they create a new reality. So at the same time, you've got every observer brings into the system their own reality. And so there's no humbleness, yeah, in there of saying, okay, first I want to learn and understand. And that's what Lansing then did. And there are so many societies where you observe this. In Polynesia, they used, all these islands, they had to live in a sustainable manner. And when the Europeans arrived in the continental United States, you can also see that they all wrote, it looks like a managed garden or something. It looks like a garden, because it was a garden, because 120 million Native Americans had managed this system in a balance that it looked as if it was a wilderness, but it wasn't a wilderness, it was a managed system. And so, to get back to this epistemology, as researchers and academics, we look at the world from a very particular perspective. We want to control things, we want to understand things, we want to create new knowledge. And this perspective is connected to a particular, very pragmatic way of looking at the world from a scientific perspective that was very successful for the past 250, 300 years. But there are many different other ways of looking at the world that are sometimes just as appropriate and more appropriate and successful than those ways. And we see it with the Lansing example, yeah? So I think we have to develop a way of changing hats and not assuming there's a reality out there, but there are different ways of looking at on constructing a reality depending on what my needs are, yeah, and who looks at it. And we always use the example, and that's a Judeo-Christian thing, that we all the talks today had this idea that there's a world and a reality out there independent from us. And I think I just had a short discussion with him about it, that we always use this example of the 7 blind men and the elephant. And then I'm done. The 7 blind men and the elephant. So one touches the leg and says an elephant is like a tree, and the other one touches the tail and says it's like a brush, and the next one touches the trunk, and so on. And so all have contradicting views of this reality. But I think, in fact, there is no elephant. And we construct these models.
Yeah, I think this relates a little bit to what I really liked about the example that you used about how they, the researcher brought the model into the world, or into the setting or the local setting where it probably doesn't even matter so much, or maybe you can say something whether, the quality of the model matters, or whether in this case it was just a case or the medium of that artifact that enticed people to come, or even just having a shared language because the civil servants liked, oh, it's a computer, and the locals liked, oh, we know the system and how it works. I mean, maybe it's not so important that the model is real. I mean, that it's got a high fidelity.
Okay. These are a lot of questions. So first off, I think the idea of the performativity approach is indeed some kind of ontological pluralism, and then to sort of ethnographically research how the knowledge practices of different people indeed are productive of different ontologies. And then the question is indeed, is that still the same world? To whom, you know? But yeah, I just leave it with the empirical stuff because I'm better at that. The question here, what role for the fidelity of the model? It's difficult to say because I did not study that ethnographically and I have to rely on the accounts of other people, right? But there is a critique of that modeling approach that Lansing used, which basically programmed particular ideas informed by evolutionary science and behavioral science as to how agents optimize their goals and so forth into the model, and then produce this wonderful outcome where basically the subaks, so these small agricultural irrigation communities, evolved over time an optimal solution, just like a sort of biological system would do. And there is the critique that basically this model sort of worked nicely as a boundary object to draw together these different worlds and then produce this outcome which was somewhat favorably to those local farmers. But however, it also sort of naturalized and sort of excluded all the historical contingencies and power struggles and all the historical change that happened to produce that landscape, which did not just evolve by people adapting, but which had a lot to do with colonialism and the politics that went on before, different religious, so Hinduism wasn't native to Bali, right? It had to come there at some point and be indigenized, and so all that was excluded from that model, which chose to frame the whole thing as an evolutionary optimization problem. And then produced apparently that outcome. So the question of the fidelity is, you know, do you believe that it happened that way, that it was indeed an evolutionary process, or do you think that a lot of entities that should be in the model to be faithful to how human societies work have been left out, so it was not, you know, it didn't have a proper correspondence? It's an open question, but I think for me the more interesting question is what happens once you introduce that model? What are the mechanisms then being set in motion by having that very model? And of course there I think I'm a little bit more on Helmreich's side, who basically said that it was the symbolic investment of high technology. This was the 1980s, the Apple Macintosh was brand new, and there was no way the Balinese local government could have afforded such a thing. And then it showed up in this water temple, the kind of thing that they wanted to sort of not necessarily get rid of, but that they didn't recognize as important at all. And suddenly it got this importance through this symbolic investment in the computer as a symbol for progress, for the kind of technologically driven progress that they wanted to implement. And it told them something completely different. And I think that's the interesting process to look there.
Yeah, but more as a utopia and how they may influence the world themselves. So first, I was thinking maybe it's not only models. We always do that, right? We have a problem. We try to imagine solution, build a utopia. Oh yeah, we want to live with more nature, or we want to have a different political system with, where we build a democracy. Greece did it. No, it was not a model. They imagined a system, maybe. Historian would be better to help us, but imagine the system, then build on that, and it became reality because they imagined a system where a specific problem could be solved. So they did it. It could be okay. Yeah, this example with fishermen works with a model. Maybe European trade carbon trade scheme, which we imagine a model. Okay, tragedy of the commons. We need to do something with CO2. In these economic models, it can work if everything works as assumed. We may solve this problem. So let's live according to these rules. So the thing with model, it's a bit different compared to just maybe pure thinking or imagine new solutions. Is that it englobes more things because it has the power to do so. Unlike a normal human, you have many more components. So it tends to be self-consistent with all these components. So also there's the temptation. Because you can really imagine practically how all these things work together, for that problem really to be solved, there's a temptation to make the world look more like the model, so that the assumptions are respected, and therefore the model will be solved. So this is, and the third point, and it's also this danger, is because of this self-consistency and the huge, the model can describe many number of things. Might forget that there's also, and there will always be, things that are not in the models, and models are not only there to describe a fully self-consistent world with all elements, but sometimes simply to identify specific dynamics, how fishermen and fishermen work on this, earn for a living. These may be 3 elements, and should be actually, instead of trying to shape the whole world to look more like this model, try to use that to feed into thinking. That don't leave the way you live and the way you take decisions to the models. It was not designed for that really, but try to learn from the model you built and the dynamic inside, and then use your human minds, which is maybe a bit less artistic, less focused and performant on one specific time, one specific problem with 3 variables, but can englobe more things. So, yeah, use the model to fit into that. Well, I don't know if it's a bit too many things, but this point, well, first, models are one tools, but are not the only thing that shape reality in a different ways. And just to imagine a system that can fix a problem, it can be many things. Yeah, maybe this. Yeah, well, that was it.
Do you want to respond? Any of you? Sure.
Just one idea that I think one of the interesting things, and that's why I was so interested, I didn't even ask that question, but in this sort of emulator, and how it then basically made available these massively complex and complicated calculations in a way that policymakers can actually use, or that you can map these physical system calculations onto political calculations, right? What kind of policies do we need to, how can we sort of create a sort of commensurability between human actions, keeping emissions below a certain level and the physical system. And I think that's interesting, because models tend to provide us with the calculative agency to actually act in the world in particular ways. And of course there they then mediate between the stuff we think about the world and the stuff that happens in the world by giving us the means, in the sense of sort of distributed cognition. We need tools to calculate, right? By giving us the means to calculate. And I think that's where the sort of performativity lies, right? Just as a comment to that.
Lies the danger that it's again about, if we only had enough data and if we only had better models, we can understand the world. Understanding the world means we can control the world. And it's exactly this kind of thinking in which, I'm not saying that you are doing this, yeah? But this that leaves no room for the unpredictable, for surprises, yeah? In the world, of course, our models of the world are those from our own experience and what we can measure, yeah, through ice cores. And of course, there's no black swan, no surprise in there, but they only work that far. And I think I would appreciate if we had models that made room for the unpredictable. And this would be a completely new and different way of, I don't know, doing science in the world, isn't it? That's a question, yeah?
But I think that probably has to do with that, I guess, like in most of the 20th century, or like, I mean, a lot of things is based on statistics, I guess, or statistics has become one of the main kind of like lenses on reality. And because, I don't know, like it's a statistical distribution is a mysterious thing that I think is essentially poorly understood, but through that inversely, like risk assessment or like the assessment of like the likeliness of a certain event, what you talked about with the like the implied nuclear disaster and things like that, has become like the thing to do in a way, because that's like the, you know, it's like the prudent thing to do is like to use the probabilistic analysis to assess the risk or the likeliness of something happening. And I think that's a mindset that probably precludes almost the kind of science you want. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, eventually it's that mindset, that mind frame, which then through emerging from theoretical physics, I guess, has kind of like pervaded the finance industry and has pervaded like a lot of our reality. I mean, like our lives are kind of governed by these models as well. Like if you want a mobile phone contract, then one of these modeling algorithms is run on you essentially to determine whether you should get that or the prepaid card, you know. Oh, that's a question. Sorry.
Yeah, I mean, I really enjoyed the talks. They're great and so diverse. I just wanted to thank you. But this discussion raises some questions for me. The computer seems to play a really pivotal role in modeling, apart from some of the real-life simulations that you mentioned, which can maybe move beyond computation as a paradigm for modeling, or a medium for modeling. And it raises the ideas of for me, around the limits of computation, which we've talked about, which are, you know, computation is deterministic, it's kind of Laplacian, can't deal with complete contingency, has no idea of entropy, and there's an interesting discourse there around the universality of computation and therefore the limits of modeling, which has kind of moved into the realm of quantum computing now, because you know, the Turing machine clearly has very specific limits about what it can represent in the world, right? So there's an interesting discourse there in quantum computing from the 80s onwards, David Deutsch, etc., talking about computation really reaching out into nature and creating what he calls perfect simulations of nature through this bottom-up quantum computing. It's an interesting terrain. But also talking about complexity in these models do produce kind of representations of complex systems. The interesting thing about the outcomes from these models, which you've touched upon, particularly when supporting actual decision making, is that the models are deterministic, but they don't allow you concrete predictions. Like you say, they allow you probabilistic predictions. And one of the things we did with urban modeling, when I was working in urban modeling, which was directly being used by policy makers, is this whole new paradigm of complexity and policy trying to understand and grapple with it is really interesting. We had to put not just probabilities in front of policymakers, but entire parameter surfaces. So the policymaker is now working with a parameter surface that he can manipulate to understand how different parameters in the model affect outcomes, and which of those parameters they have control over, because the policymaker often only controls, you know, less and less parameters. Actually, today the market controls a lot of them. So we're sitting down policymakers in front of parameter surfaces, and you see this real fascinating kind of paradigm shift into complexity in the modeling, and explaining that even though the models are sophisticated and have a lot of different components, they don't allow you concrete predictions. Yeah. Well, I haven't been in the room. I've been working on the models, assisting, but those models are heavily integrated now. I think a number of complexity models into urban decision making, particularly around land use, which is an area the government has a lot of control over, understanding how changing land use affects in transport, business, retail, all these things. So quite kind of pragmatic things there. and they are quite integrated into the process now.
Allocate the resources for, you know, putting models in place. And I mean, of course, if you're relying on large computing centers, you know, there's such a high cost in producing accurate models or high fidelity models in the end. And I mean, sometimes it's even a question in industry just to say, okay, here's the cutoff point. We don't need to model this elaborate thing. A simple polygon is enough for us, just to get an idea of something. And you know, there's almost this pick and mix of where you need fidelity or where you need a very detailed model. And I guess in these very applied settings, it's much more common, and also you have much more cases, or many more cases of, you know, how these, you know, even how many postdocs or doctoral researchers you get to do climate modeling, whereas or military modeling perhaps in industry. But I guess there's a lot of, or maybe architectural modeling, but there's some better models than others.
Yeah. I mean, that's basically what I'm trying to get at in my own doctoral research. How do the pragmatics of modeling, all those micro decisions that are being made, how do they in the end produce political effects by way of the model then being introduced in the policy process, right? So there's this sort of back and forth there that's really interesting. And of course, you know, funding plays a role, deadlines play a role, and conferences, and if you can go there and whatever, all that, and the availability of software packages, and all that plays a role, and all that then has effects on the decisions that policymakers take. Sometimes, although less than the scientists actually would like to, of course. Yeah.
It just made me think that maybe the computing power for the architectural utopia might be the interns in the architecture firms, like how the fidelity of the utopia gets determined by the workforce essentially that's available, and then things get cut down.